Paul talks about worry, about anxiety. He also talks about peace. Who wouldn't like a little more peace and a little less anxiety? Studies have shown that richer countries have higher rates of anxiety than poorer countries. That doesn't seem to make sense, since a lot of times we feel like if we get a little more money, we'll have a little more peace and we'll be able to solve our problems, and then we'll have less anxiety. But it turns out that richer countries who have more material wealth are more anxious, and that actually puts Americans at the top of the pack in terms of anxiety. It's not a gold medal that you want in the Olympics. And so Paul lays out here a map for dealing with anxiety. The anxiety that he's dealing with in particular in this passage is of a particular situation. Paul here is writing from prison. And the church in Philippi has warm feelings about Paul. He spent time with them, ministering to them, loving them, caring for them, and vice versa. And so they are anxious for Paul's release. They are anxious about his well-being. And I think that situation about feeling anxious for the well-being of others is certainly something that is on our national radar this morning, for the release, for the well-being of others, a well-being that we watch from afar and don't have the ability to touch personally with our hands. And maybe there are situations in your life that also fall in that category, that you're anxious about, that you're worried about, but that you have little control over. I know, talking to some folks whose children are grown and now have families of their own, that as they talk with their friends, what I've heard from one person in particular is that the hardest thing for them is watching the challenges that their kids face and not being there and not really being able to have a lot of control over it. And I can imagine that, at least right now, just as a kid, I can jump in and just sweep Luke and Matt up and hug them and be there. But if you're not able to do that, that would be really hard. So anxiety about situations that you have little control over. So here are the things that Paul says in that circumstance. The first thing he says is to rejoice in the Lord. Rejoice in the Lord. That seems like pouring salt on the wound. I'm worried. I'm scared. Be happy. Really? But what Paul is saying is not to brush it under the rug, not to put, not to suck it up stoically and put a grin on it. He is saying, rejoice not in your circumstances, not in whatever situation is bothering you. Rejoice in the Lord. The address where joy is found is in the Lord. It's not in any of those things. And so this joy that he is talking about is not a joy that comes from within. It's not a joy that comes from anything on this earth. It's a joy that comes from outside of it all, in the Lord. And that's the location where it resides. And that, as we change the focus of what we're thinking about, where our anxieties are in the Lord, that's where joy can be born. Jesus says, in this world you will face troubles and find that you will be persecuted, and it will be hard. He said, I don't give as the world gives. Don't let your hearts be troubled. Don't let them be afraid. My peace I leave with you. My peace I give to you. And from that comes joy in the Lord. The second thing he says is to make your benevolence known to all people. Make your benevolence be manifest to all. He's saying that Christians should be characterized by benevolence. Uh, and the root of that word, too, comes from the word lenient, or mellow. Uh, and what he's saying is that Christians are people that are benevolent, that are lenient, that are not judgmental and condemning of others. And the reason why is because we have been judged and forgiven. That Christians are people who have been shown grace and love, and so that their disposition toward others is also charity and benevolence and goodwill. Luther puts it this way. He said, "Before God, be glad at all times, rejoice in the Lord. Before men, be lenient." And that's a good summary of the two things that he says first. We've heard a lot of stories, and I've heard a lot of stories, and if you've turned on the radio or TV at all this week, you've heard a lot of stories about first-person accounts and experiences of both people who are and were in Houston as the unexpected flooding came, but also people that are now helping out. And there was an interview with one man from New Orleans who was a victim of Katrina, and who had the gift of cooking. And he himself lost everything in Katrina. And it was devastating and extremely difficult, but he was helped. There were people that stepped in and were benevolent to him and helped him. And so when he saw this on TV, the first thing he did was he packed up and he went in to show his benevolence because he had been helped. He went to help others. And that is why Paul encourages us to be benevolent, because benevolence has been shown to us. And if we sit back and think about the ways that God's benevolence has been shown to us through people, I think we would have ample reason to be benevolent ourselves. The third thing he says is that the Lord is near. That the Lord is near. The time of rejoicing is at the door. The Lord is near. Why joy? Why benevolence? Is because the Lord is near. There is another story I heard of a seminary professor who was in one of the suburbs that was really clobbered by Harvey. And he teaches a class on a doctrine called the providence of God. And that doctrine is about the idea that God provides for us. God orders our lives and our world in such a way that it is for our good. And so you can imagine that as someone who teaches this, and his account of it is, he says, it's easy to talk about that in an air-conditioned classroom with a coffee cup in my hand. It's a little bit harder to really hold that to heart when I see the floodwaters coming in and threatening to wipe me and my family away. It's harder to think about how God's providence relates to that. And so the story continues, and he says that as he and his family made the decision to leave, one of his neighbors came in and asked if she could stay at his house while all this was happening, and hopeful that on the second floor she would be safe. And so in the split-second decision, they said, you're welcome to come with us, you're welcome to stay. And as they left, his wife said the only thing that she could think to say, which is, "Jesus be with you." And he says that as he was leaving the scene, and as he finally got to safety, he was confronted with a wall of people heading the other direction. He was confronted with rescue workers and people who put their lives on the line all the time to help and save people who were put in harm's way. But he was also confronted with people that had cars like you would see in our parking lot with boats attached to them, driving with their personal boats to go and help people who were in harm's way. And he says that is where I saw God's providence. That is where I saw God at work. Reflected in that was Jesus, who came to be with us in our suffering, to help us in the midst of our time of need. The next thing that he talks about and commends to us is, in everything, in prayer and thanksgiving, make your requests known to God. In everything, in prayer and thanksgiving, make your requests known to God. These days, I think prayer sometimes gets a bad rap. I think that sometimes prayer is associated with a Christian excuse to not do something, or laziness, or even impotence. And while that may be an idea, it's certainly not the biblical idea of prayer. Prayer in Scripture is the opposite of laziness. It's the opposite of inaction. It's the opposite of impotence. If we look at Jesus and his life of prayer, we see that it is right there at the center of everything that he did, that it was the source of his power, that it was the source of his ability to do all of the things that he did. Anytime, if you pay attention in the Gospels, something amazing happens in Jesus' ministry, it's always preceded by prayer. It is always preceded by prayer, including his death and resurrection. So for Jesus, prayer was preparation and prayer was power. And it's the same for us. Prayer is preparation. Prayer helps us to orient our minds to what God has in mind for us. It reorients us. It helps us to see things from God's perspective. And not just prayer, but Paul says prayer and thanksgiving. Now, what I find interesting is that there in recent years, there have been a lot of publications and articles about really kind of the scientific underscoring of what Paul is talking about here, that our brains are wired to need what the Bible calls prayer, to need meditation, to need a time to reorient ourselves, to stop the thoughts of anxiety and worry and confusion and catastrophizing. Studies show that prayer helps, that prayer makes us less anxious, that it makes us more effective and more productive. But the other thing that studies show is that gratitude does the same thing. And gratitude, it turns out, helps on the chemical level in our brains. It rewires our brains. When we dwell on thoughts of anxiety and worry and all of those things that our minds keep going back to, ruts are made in our synapses, and our brain continues to go back and fall back into that pattern more and more. But what they say is, when you find yourself doing that, stop and think about something you're grateful for. Think about anything you're grateful for. Think about the Indianapolis Indians in the playoffs this year, or the Cubs, or chocolate or ice cream, or anything that you're grateful for. Whatever is good, Paul says, think about that. Think about that. And as you do that, the peace of the Lord, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds. Amen.